From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Ask a teacher about the hardest part of their job, and you might expect them to say long hours or low pay. But there's another, less visible challenge that educators face: exposure to student trauma. Students may confide in a teacher about not having enough to eat at home or an abusive family member. And exposure to those problems takes a serious toll on teachers. That's according to a new study out of the University of Northern Colorado. It found that about 9 out of 10 teachers and other classroom educators dealt with what's called secondary traumatic stress from helping students with their problems. And for nearly half of those educators, that traumatic stress was considered severe.
I was really surprised. I didn't expect the percentage to be as high as it was. It kind of led me to thinking more into the whys and the why behind why it might be so high in educators.
That's Breanna King. She's a graduate student in school psychology at UNC. She designed and led that study and talked with me about ideas for how to help teachers cope. Secondary traumatic stress is something that's common in first responders or mental health professionals who are exposed to, hearing life and death situations. Could you briefly define secondary traumatic stress and what prompted you to look for this among teachers?
Yeah, so secondary traumatic stress are kind of those negative outcomes that we experience when being exposed to the trauma of others. And research has found that the symptoms of secondary traumatic stress actually mirror those of post-traumatic stress disorder. Even hearing about other people's trauma kind of fits that criteria of PTSD. We think about mental health professionals and first responders, like you said, as being exposed to trauma on a pretty regular basis just due to their occupation.
Sure.
And educators in the school system are working with students every single day, most of the day. And we know that a large proportion of our students have experienced a trauma by the age of 16. So I really wanted to kind of look at how student trauma was affecting educators.
Could you help us understand a little bit more about the nature of what teachers hear from their students and kind of how it affects teachers after they go home for the day?
Of course, yeah. I mean, they hear everything ranging from, I lost a loved one to, I've been witnessing kind of domestic violence in the home or housing insecurity, food insecurity, a lot of grief, or even just not feeling accepted at home. There are lots of kiddos who don't feel seen, don't feel heard, and they come to school and that might be a safe place for them. And so teachers and educators are hearing about it sometimes directly from students, sometimes from other staff. And a lot of times teachers go home thinking about those students and it kind of sticks with them at the end of the day. And knowing that they don't have any control over what's happening at home, but that student is kind of stuck in that house can be stressful.
Yeah, you kind of get a little bit of a helpless feeling. You want to do something, but, It's interesting to me because I think of teaching as being less stressful than being, say, a paramedic. But that's really not what you found. I'm wondering if you could help me picture this kind of day to day. Do you have any stories about a teacher who was deeply stressed from dealing with a student's problems?
I was working with a student in a high school whose family had been going through a lot. They lost 2 family members within the span of a month. And it was about 7 of them living in one house. But one day, one of the kiddos came into school and, one of the teachers just noticed that they were not themselves. They seemed a little bit withdrawn and just not as energetic and talkative as usual. So the teacher shared with us that they had been evicted from their house that morning. So it was just a really traumatic experience having someone show up at their house and kind of make them pack their bags and get out. And, the teacher was like, what can I do? How can we support this kiddo? And there are limits to what we can do as educators. There are boundaries that are in place. So It can be really, like you said, a helpless feeling. And I'm sure he went home that night thinking about wishing he could help more.
We've been talking mainly about how this exposure to trauma affects teachers, but I can imagine that having teachers who grapple with what amounts to PTSD probably affects the students in turn. What did you learn about this?
Teacher stress directly affects the kiddos in the classroom. I think students can really feel when a teacher is stressed out, and teachers can act differently when they're stressed. So there has been research that's found teachers who are experiencing higher levels of stress are more likely to report behavioral instances in the classroom. And then when the kids start having big behaviors in the classroom, that also increases the teacher's stress level. So it kind of becomes this cycle that's hard to break.
Breanna, I am curious why we're hearing about this now. I mean, has it always been this way? Or are there recent trends that are making this a bigger problem than it used to be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I really think that educator stress has been more of a priority because of the turnover that we've seen and the shortages we've seen across the country, especially coming out of the COVID pandemic. Burnout was kind of the buzzword for a long time, and everybody attributed it to burnout. And now we're learning that it might be a little bit deeper than burnout.
So what kind of solutions do you think schools might offer to help teachers who are dealing with secondary traumatic stress?
Yeah, I think first of all, acknowledging it, right? I think it's hard to kind of go up against something when you don't know what it is. And I think administration acknowledging that secondary trauma is a thing and, normalizing that it's okay if you're struggling because you have a lot on your shoulders and you have a lot on your plate. And like you said, you come into this field wanting to help kids and you take on their pain and their struggle as well. And I also think creating space to talk about it with educators, not making them feel like they're on an island, but allowing some of that community to come together and talk about the hard parts of the job, because there are a lot of hard parts.
We hear a lot about teachers leaving the field altogether. How much of a factor do you think secondary traumatic stress is in that attrition?
Yeah, so there have been studies showing in other professions that secondary traumatic stress correlates with intention to leave the field. And I would assume that is similar to the field of education. I can imagine that a lot of teachers, it gets to the point where, they came in it for the kids and it's not even really about the kids anymore. It's about kind of self-preservation and taking care of themselves. And to do that, they unfortunately have to leave and go in a different direction. And I think if we can kind of intercede before it gets that bad, then we can really focus on retaining our teachers and taking care of them so they can take care of our students.
Yeah, and I think there's an advantage to lowering turnover, for students to see the same teachers year after year is helpful.
Absolutely.
Breanna, if I am someone with a teacher in my life or a parent whose kid is in school, how can I try to be helpful to a teacher who might be experiencing these feelings?
I would say, honestly, just ask them how they're doing. And just talking about it can really release some of that burden on yourself. So that would be the one thing I would think of.
I like that. No apple on the desk. That's old, ancient history, right? Okay.
Yes. And showing appreciation. I think sometimes the job is a thankless job in a lot of ways. So I think just saying thank you can go a long way.
Breanna King is a graduate student at the University of Northern Colorado. She studied the high rates of secondary traumatic stress in teachers. We'll put a link to her research in our show notes and at KUNC.org. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.